tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So hello everyone and welcome to Dharma Bum Basics. Today we'll be continuing our exploration of dependent origination. This is basically the third installment of talking about dependent origination. I'll probably link in the description box below, I'll probably link the last two because for this one, we won't talk too much about the first half of dependent origination. We'll focus on the second bit that I haven't talked about yet. So if you're interested in learning about the entire process, it would be good to go back and watch those two other videos. So with that, I think we'll go right into a meditation because that feels just about right. Yeah. So if this is your first time sitting with us, if you're sitting in a chair, it's helpful to have feet flat on the ground, not fully utilizing the backrest. Tongue can be pressed up against the roof of the mouth, gently against the back of the teeth. Prevents the buildup of saliva, which can become distracting. Imagining a string pulling the crown of the head up, straightening out the back, and then bringing the shoulders up and back and relaxing down into a sturdy posture. Know that throughout the meditation, your mind will wander. That's normal, that's okay. We're not trying to stop our thoughts. We're trying to change our relationship to them. So at no point during the meditation should you expect to think nothing or try to forcefully stop the thoughts. The thoughts are there and they'll keep being there. It's just as likely that they'll stop, that the heart will stop beating or the lungs will stop breathing. And by that point, your thoughts are the least of your worries. So we'll get started. Throughout the meditation, I'll give some instructions like breathing into the eyes and the ears. This is perceptual exercise to move sensation of breath and awareness throughout the body. Certain areas in the body, like maybe the center of the head or the center of the chest, we might not be sure how to consciously relax. So we use this perception of breath to inform those parts that we'd like them to relax. That's pretty much it. We'll get started. Taking 3 deep breaths slowly. And settling into a natural rhythm of breath. You could even pose the question in the mind as to what kind of breathing would feel best for the body in this moment, and simply observe how the body responds. You could think energizing breathing or calming breathing, and just see what happens. And as you begin to settle down with the breath, take a minute to relate the breath back to the mind. Notice what kind of perceptions you hold about the breath, what kind of preconceived notions you hold about the breath. And see if adjusting those perceptions adjusts sensation of breath. For example, do you perceive breath as simply air coming in and out of the lungs? What if you perceived it as that which gives you life, that which nourishes the entire body? Without the breath, this body wouldn't continue. And at the same time, it's nothing you need to force. The breath's been with you your entire life, and it will keep coming in and out, regardless whether you're making it or not. Simply inviting the breath to expand past the lungs and the stomach, to fill the body. Allowing our awareness and sensation of breathing to be perceived as one thing, one fluid activity. So if you want to spread breath through the body, you can simply spread awareness and the breath will follow. As you're spreading this breath awareness through the body, if you come across any tension or a sense of blockage, you can just imagine this breath awareness flowing through it gently, dissolving tension, eroding blockages, bit by bit with each breath. Until the breath can flow smoothly throughout the entire body. Up to the crown of the head and out the arms, all the way down to the soles of the feet. Just taking your time. If you want, as you're spreading this breath awareness throughout the body, you can imagine that it flows in through the surface of the skin, in through the pores, so you don't have to push or pull it from anywhere else. Gently flows into the body, filling the body as you breathe in, and it radiates out from the body as you breathe out, dissolving tension in the forehead, around the eyes, the scalp, the neck and shoulders. Relaxing the chest and the stomach, soothing the back and the spine, allowing the breath to really nourish the body. Relaxing the hips and the knees and the calves and the feet. Breathing in, nourishing the body. Breathing out, soothing tension. Maintaining this full-bodied awareness. You can slowly begin to stretch if necessary. Just trying to maintain this awareness as you do so. And as you slowly begin to open the eyes, try not to let the mind go flowing out with the eyes. Try to maintain the center, just for a little bit. I know that can be particularly hard when there's a screen right in front of us. We're kind of habitually conditioned to let our awareness soak right into the screen. But it's a useful skill to learn how to stay centered within, regardless of what's trying to pull us without. So, with tonight's topic, Transcendent Dependent Origination, we'll be discussing how you can use the same process of dependent origination to lead, instead of leading to suffering, to use it to lead away from suffering to freedom. So with the classic dependent origination, it's basically defined as these 12 causal links. It starts with ignorance, meaning seeing things in terms of like and don't like, mine and not mine, as opposed to cause and effect and skillful and unskillful. Not seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. So it starts with ignorance as its prime condition. It's not really the beginning, but it's as close to a beginning as we've got. So it starts with ignorance, and then it runs through into giving rise to craving. And then craving eventually gives rise to aging, illness, death, sorrow, lamentation, distress, and despair, or suffering, dukkha. So that's kind of how that process works. And I know I said I wouldn't really go into detail on that, but I think I'll just go through it really quick in case you didn't see last week's video. So where dependent origination is this process of, through ignorance, we create craving and then suffering. Transcendent dependent origination is where we can use suffering as a motivating factor to give rise to conviction, ultimately giving rise to freedom. So with traditional dependent origination or dependent arising, you have ignorance, which I've already explained. Then you have fabrications, which is basically how the mind will fashion things together. It's its tendency to fashion things together. You have consciousness, meaning we're capable of interpreting sensory input. We have that capacity. From consciousness comes name and form, or mentality and materiality, meaning the kind of the collection of perceptions and assumptions that we hold. Like when we see a car, we don't have to think about what it's called. We know that car is car. So it's just our bundle of perceptions and conditioning are the labels that we place on things. And then from name and form as a prerequisite condition comes the 6 senses. Sight, sound, smell, taste, tactile sensation, and consciousness. Then from that, we have contact. Contact is when one of these 6 senses, when ear meets sound, that's the moment of contact. And then a sensation arises. It's either a pleasant, an unpleasant, or a neutral sound. And then from that sensation, we create a story about why we find it pleasant, why we find it unpleasant, or we just don't care about that because it's too neutral. It doesn't have juicy enough of a charge for us to care about, right? And then from craving comes clinging. And clinging is when we start to feed off of that story of why we liked or didn't like. We start to really create that story and fill it in and give it lots of nice side characters and all of that. But the plot's usually not that good. And then from clinging comes becoming. Another translation of becoming, bhavana, is habitual tendency, which I prefer because I think it gets the point across a little more. So we have habitual tendencies. Through consistent craving and clinging, we build up habits. And then those habits eventually give rise to birth. It can mean birth in a new life, but it mainly means for us, birth of action, where this habitual tendency builds enough. If we have a habitual tendency to, when we're hungry, to go get pizza, then the birth is the action of driving to go get pizza or calling the delivery guy. And then from birth comes death, aging and death, which basically means that you had that moment of fulfillment when you're fantasizing about the pizza, and then when you're eating the pizza, and then that fulfillment dies away because it's not a consistent pleasure. And ultimately that ends in suffering because it started in ignorance. So that's dependent origination, classic dependent origination. And then from there, I'll cover, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to leave them in the live chat, and I'll get to them after I'm done going through transcendent dependent origination. So there's might be more than 2, but as far as I know, there's 2 different interpretations of transcendent dependent origination. They're largely similar, just the first few links are slightly different. I linked in the description box below the 2 different lines of dependent origination or transcendent dependent origination, and then also the origination of ignorance, a different sutra, which I think you might find interesting. Since we're not really going into what causes ignorance, we're using ignorance as the primary cause here. So with transcendent dependent origination, you have suffering as the cause, the primary cause, which is what dependent origination ends with. And then you try to transcend, right? So from suffering results, as the Buddha said, in one of two ways. Either in bewilderment, you're suffering, you're in bewilderment, you're in a state of confusion, and then you fall back into ignorance and you start the cycle of suffering again. So it suffering either ends in bewilderment or in search. Someone must know a way or two to end the suffering. There must be a way to end the suffering. And this is what's called faith or conviction in Buddhism, is the belief that it's possible to end our suffering. It's not faith in a higher power. It's not faith in any kind of deity. It's faith in our ability to end our own suffering, or for the ability to end suffering. So within Buddhism, that's what faith or conviction means. And it's just that acknowledgement that we've been suffering for so long, and we finally acknowledge there must be a better way to live my life. There must be a way to live my life that doesn't cause so much suffering for myself and those around me. Then from that realization, the heart kind of intuits, it knows that that's got to be true. There's got to be some way out. And then gladness arises. So suffering, faith, gladness arises. And this is just that, that bit of relief, that sigh of relief from this, knowing that, yes, that you know that to be true. You're not sure quite how to go about it yet, but you know that it must be possible. There's all these great monks and masters and stuff who you can see who just seem freer than we do. And it's a source of faith and gladness. Then from gladness comes joy or rapture, just kind of that, an excitable happiness that this is possible. I've stumbled upon something. This is possible. And then from that sense of relief and that sense of energy, eventually that allows the body to grow calm, to have a sense of tranquility. And then as tranquility is a prerequisite condition, then arises contentment or bliss. So the body grows calm. As a result of the body growing calm, so does the heart. We have contentment, mental contentment and bliss. And when the body's calm and the mind's at ease, concentration arises. In Buddhist practice, concentration isn't something that we make happen. It's something that we maintain the causes for it to arise. So concentration arises from the body and the mind being at ease. And then when the mind becomes concentrated, insight arises. Seeing things clearly, or knowledge and vision of things as they have come to be. So seeing things not through our interpretation of them, but seeing them as they are, without all our storylines and all our nonsense that we pile on top of them. That's insight, that's wisdom, is seeing things as they are. And then from seeing things as they are comes disenchantment, where we see through a lot of the allure of things that we found enjoyable, but were actually causing us suffering upon reflection. Or we found enjoyable, but we realize that they're actually getting in the way of a deeper sense of contentment, bliss, and happiness. So we become disenchanted with them. We see through the illusion that we created around these things. We see that they don't deliver happiness the way that we thought they did, right? This predominantly means things outside, external things, because everything's subject to change. Nothing can provide true and lasting happiness if it's external. Then from disenchantment, seeing through these things, comes dispassion. And I know that that can sound kind of unpleasant, dispassion, the absence of passion. But within Buddhist practice, I like to think of the term passion being used similarly within the context of like a crime of passion. No one thinks that the passion in a crime of passion is a good thing. That passion that leads you to kill another person, right? That your emotions go so out of control, you're impassioned with this and you do something really regrettable. So dispassion is the cooling of the inflamed heart. It's allowing us to take a minute to see that the heart doesn't have to be on fire all the time, inflamed all of the time. We can step back and we can be without passion. And being without passion doesn't mean that we're without bliss or joy. It means it clears the way for a deeper and less unshakable or more unshakable happiness. And then from dispassion comes freedom, because we've freed ourselves from trying to make everything go the way we want it to, make everything be the way we want it to be. So freedom arises. And then from freedom as a prerequisite condition comes knowledge of the ending of the effluence. And the effluence means, effluent means like, can mean like drainage or runoff. It means the mind that's flowing out in the world to find sources of food. And it's cutting off those effluents because we found a source of food within. And those effluents were a big cause of our suffering. So knowledge of the ending of the effluents, you gain the sense of freedom, and then you see what leads to total freedom. and you're able to end those effluents. So I'll probably stop there for now. I probably have a few more things I could say, but I'm more curious if y'all have any questions about anything I just said, anything like that. And while you're typing, I'll just go through that much simpler one last time. From suffering comes faith. From faith comes gladness. From gladness comes joy and rapture. From joy and rapture comes calm, the body growing calm. From calm comes contentment and bliss. From contentment and bliss comes concentration. From concentration comes insight, or knowledge and vision of things as they have come to be. From insight comes disenchantment. From disenchantment, dispassion. From dispassion, freedom. And from freedom, knowledge of the ending of the effluence. Effluence, the second one. Yeah. I think it literally means like drainage or runoff or something, but it has to do with the mind flowing out. This is the context that's used within Buddhism. And there's basically like 4 effluents that are referred to. Sometimes they're also referred to, or can be referred to, as fetters. F-E-T-T-E-R, fetter, I think. I'm not a speller. And these effluents are kind of wrong perceptions, wrong perceptions. One of them is the effluent of sense desire, which is all things are pleasant. All sensory experience is pleasant. It's a wrong view, right? There's plenty that isn't pleasant. Or fulfilling all our sense desires is pleasant, but there's plenty of cases where we end up not really wanting what we thought we wanted. Views of the self are one of the effluents. Thinking that it's worth all of this energy to create and display this character that we're playing as throughout our entire lives. That it's worth all the effort to create this image of ourselves that we like to flaunt in front of others or whatever. And then there's the effluent of wrong view, which is the effluent of thinking that I'm the only one that's right, I know best all of the time, blah, blah, blah. And that's the effluent of views. And then there's the effluent of ignorance, which is ignoring the suffering that we're in. So Daniel asked, what is the meaning of the sutta where Buddha tells Ananda that if the Buddha wanted to, he could live until the end of the age? Later, Ananda asks him to live until the end of the age, and the Buddha says, it's too late for that, and Ananda should have begged him 3 times earlier to keep living, and that this is all Ananda's fault. You know, I've read that sutra. I don't really have an opinion on it one way or another. Sometimes things get lost in translation. Sometimes things don't necessarily make sense. I myself tend to veer away from getting stuck in discussions about like the supernatural elements of the canon. That being said, I don't necessarily perceive like the past life, future life thing as supernatural. I perceive it as a continuation of consciousness. But some of the more mystical elements I'm not all that familiar with or that drawn to. This is likely a better question to ask Alex than me. He's more familiar with kind of the story of the Buddha's life and those more mystical elements. So Eric said, this sounds like just a description of experience that may result as one pursues the Eightfold Path, correct? Or is there some side actions that lead to this transcending experience? No, that's exactly right. So with dependent origination and transcendent dependent origination, if you look at the Four Noble Truths, you can kind of see how these two things together fit into this formula of the Four Noble Truths, especially considering that most of the time the Buddha goes backwards with this. I find that a little harder to keep track of, so I go forward with it. But typically what you would have is like aging and death has birth as a prerequisite condition. Birth has becoming, becoming has clinging, and he goes backwards. And if you look at the Four Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths are also in a reverse cause and effect. I'm not totally sure why he does that, but so the first noble truth is that in life there is suffering. So he examines the effect first and then identifies the cause. So it's often compared to how a doctor treats a disease. First, they identify what kind of conditions or symptoms that the patient has, and then they try to identify what the cause of those symptoms are, right? So, not a doctor. So with the Four Noble Truths, it's that similar reverse cause and effect, where you have, in life there is suffering, and here's the cause of suffering. With dependent origination, you have aging and death, suffering, as the first thing that the Buddha talks about, and that's the first noble truth. Second noble truth is the cause of suffering, and the cause of suffering is exactly this dependent origination. Oftentimes you'll hear the cause of suffering is ignorance, or the cause of suffering is craving. Those are both right, because the cause of suffering that the Buddha saw when he was deep in meditation and saw the inner workings of the mind is he saw dependent origination. So he saw how ignorance leads to craving and craving leads to suffering. So that fits the formula of the first two noble truths. There's actually there's a quote by the Buddha that says, one who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma. One who sees the Dharma sees dependent origination, which highlights how essential the Buddha saw dependent origination as part of his teachings. Because that was the very insight that led to discovering the Four Noble Truths, that led to freeing himself, was this process of dependent origination. Which is why I've spent 3 classes on it, because it's really important to have at least somewhat of a grasp on it as a practitioner. And then if you go through to the third and fourth noble truth, third noble truths, it's possible to completely uproot our suffering. An end of suffering is possible. The final link on transcendent dependent origination is this freedom and this ending of the effluence, this ending of the sources of our suffering. And then the rest of dependent origination, or transcendent dependent origination, is the process through which practicing the Eightfold Path, which is the fourth noble truth, leads to this end of suffering. And in fact, let's see if I have it. So the alternate version of this transcendent dependent origination, almost all of it's the same except for like the first 2. And this version, I think, more highlights the Eightfold Path. So at one time, Ananda asked the Buddha, what is the purpose of skillful virtues? And then the Buddha gave this kind of transcendent dependent origination in this form. Skillful virtues have freedom from remorse as their reward. Freedom from remorse has joy as its purpose and its reward. So it kind of gets rid of, replaces faith and gladness with living virtuously, and then not having remorse because you're living virtuously. So I think that even more highlights that it's part of the Eightfold Path. So this is, in sense, like the Eightfold Path is things that we're trying to develop. We're trying to give rise to. We're trying to have correct view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. We're trying to develop these things. And the process, the maybe slightly more linear process of developing these things takes the form of this transcendent dependent origination. It's a good question. Yeah. Eric also shared, he thinks the order of the truths makes sense. There's little motivation to find a cure unless you recognize that there's a problem. He interprets it as life often sucks. This is why here's a prescription to have it suck a lot less and experience more joy. One of my favorite interpretations of the Four Noble Truths was from my buddy Austin, and he talked about them being like an infomercial, and I just loved that. It was like, do you suffer in life? Did you know that this is what's causing your suffering? And then we're here to tell you that it's possible to completely eradicate your suffering. And how? With this Eightfold Path, for free, easy payments of nothing. So I find that so beautiful, and it's a wonderful comparison too, because for me, I get really irritated with like infomercials and stuff like that. But now, anytime I end up seeing an infomercial of any kind, I think of the Four Noble Truths. So it like brought skillfulness to something that normally irritates me. So I just love that example. He did it a lot better because he's a stand-up comedian, but oh man, it's good stuff. So the other thing I wanted to kind of touch on is we have, I've discussed these two aspects of dependent origination, and dependent origination, transcendent dependent origination, and then last week I talked about codependence origination, which was me taking this causal process and applying it to one of my own personality traits that gets me in a lot of trouble. That codependence, that craving for other people's affection, all that stuff. And applying the same causal phenomenon to that. And the thing I kind of wanted to mention with that this dependent origination is often spoken of in two ways, right? So dependent origination in the abstract, which is kind of how Jeff talks about it, which is all day long things happen and we react, more stuff happens, more reactions, that causal chain, right? Without the specifics. And that really is dependent origination. And then what I've been talking about is an application of dependent origination. So when this causal, I guess you could call it causal reasoning, is applied to the problem of suffering, where you apply it to suffering and then you work backwards to find out what the cause of suffering is, you get these 12 links of dependent origination. When this causal reasoning is applied to the end of suffering and you work backwards, you get transcendent dependent origination. So in the same way that I took this causal reasoning and applied it to my codependence to kind of trace how that takes form, when it starts to become an issue, when it starts to have a negative impact, stuff like that. And it can be really beneficial to take these processes or to take this process of when this happens, this arises. With the abandoning of this comes the abandoning of that. And that's all of dependent origination is with this as a prerequisite, this arises. Without this, this can't arise. Do I have a written version to share? I will type it up and then maybe I'll share it on the temple Facebook page. Yeah, I'll type it up there. I don't have it typed up. I just wrote it in my little hand journal, which I highly encourage anyone to get. In terms, last week when I shared about the codependence origination, someone, I think it was David, asked if I had an outline for applying this dependent origination, this causal reasoning to our issues. And I don't necessarily have one. I'm not quite sure how to approach making one, but I hope to have it by the end of this month, probably. I just have to give it some more thought. But in essence, it's finding out what one of our biggest issues is, or where we usually tend to crash and burn, and then being a bit of a detective or an archaeologist and working our way back from that crash and burn to see both where we lost control and what led up to us losing control. And if that's a bit too challenging, you can always start keeping a record every time you have some kind of flare-up of your issues. You can keep a record of kind of generally what was happening at that time, potential causes to that effect, things like that. Dependent origination is of great benefit when developed and studied and all that good stuff. I do have 3 sutras down below. I think I put 3 down there. And yeah, they're all a little different. They're the 2 that I talked about, and then applying the same causal reasoning to ignorance to find the beginning of ignorance. Of course, in Buddhism, there's no definite beginning to anything really, but it can be helpful. And I would expect having 3 or 4 examples of this causal reasoning might make it a little easier to figure out how to go about it yourself. So with that, we'll probably close unless anyone has like a burning question or anything. Yeah. No burning questions. I guess everyone's heart is cooled, so that's good. So it was an absolute pleasure sitting with you all tonight. Yeah, my name's Travis. I'm a Dharma Bum. I'm not a teacher or a guru or a monk or anything else. I'm simply a practitioner sharing my interpretation of the Buddhist teachings with other practitioners. Yeah. Here at the Dharma Bum Temple, we have free classes pretty much every night of the week. Most of our schedule is online now. You can go to the dharmabums.org to see our full schedule. Between YouTube and Zoom, we have almost everything covered. We're not free just because it's a pandemic. We're always free, and we'll always continue to be free. So if comfortable, please join palms, and we'll close with the transfer of merit. May all beings in all directions, without limit or end, be healthy, joyful, and at ease. May we all be healthy, joyful, and at ease. Metta karuna mudita upekkha sahanga teya cetasa chaturi sambharatvam harati Samabunarupavena, Samadhammarupavena, Samasangharupavena, Sote Huntu Nirantarang.